rate cuts. Let me show you what I'm referring to. We're going to go right over to CNBC. And oh, by the way, at the end of this video, I'm going to go ahead and outline the top 3 myths about the Federal Reserve. And these are things that are just said over and over and over and over and over and over again about the Federal Reserve. They're completely inaccurate. But because they're said so many times, people don't even question their accuracy. I can assure you at the end of this video, I'm going to piss off a lot of people. So stay tuned for that. How's that for a cliffhanger? All right, so let's shoot over to CNBC and see what we've got from Jerome Powell. He's starting to let the cat out of the bag, guys. He's showing you his true colors. The truth is coming out. Fed Chair Powell says holding rates high for too long could jeopardize economic growth. Ooh. So we've gone from hawkish Jerome Powell. Oh, we're going to keep rates higher for longer. No, remember, I'm Paul Volcker. I'm a reincarnation of Paul Volcker. That's right. And now we've gone more towards, well, we got to start making excuses now because we know we're going to start dropping rates sooner than later. And we don't want to surprise the market. So we have to start kind of planting those seeds now with the mainstream media. And we have to justify why we're going to be dropping rates without admitting there's anything wrong with the economy. Of course, the economy is strong and resilient. But we just have to drop rates just, well, you know, just, well, because we're just going to drop rates. That's what it always boils down to. They just can't admit the fact that the U.S. economy, or the global economy for that matter, is not running on all 8 cylinders. They have to kind of tap dance around the truth the whole time. Key talking points. Fed Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on Tuesday expressed concern that holding interest rates too high too long could jeopardize economic growth. So again, he's just planting that seed. And then he's kind of giving a hat tip, so to speak, to the market, giving a little bit of a nod saying, hey, guys, I can't come right out and say that I'm going to be dropping rates sooner than later, but just read between the lines here. Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment, Powell said in remarks. What happened to Paul Volcker? What happened to the hawkish speak? What happened to the Fed being tough on inflation? Well, last time I checked, inflation still isn't at their ridiculous, bogus target that they just pulled out of their rear end. That is 2%. In fact, that's one of the Fed myths that wasn't even on my list that I should probably go over, is where they got that stupid 2% number. It literally was something they just pulled out of a hat. It didn't. It's not based on any model, any science. They just said, let's see here. Yeah, 2%. That sounds good. Yeah, let's go with that. And the next thing you know, it becomes economic policy, as though it was written in stone and brought down on templates from Mount Sinai by Moses. All right, getting back to the article. So Jerome Powell is sitting there basically nodding that, hey, guys, we got to start dropping rates pretty soon here because the economy is getting really weak. The fundamentals are not looking good. And we go over these powerful economic indicators on this channel all the time. So you guys know what I'm referring to as far as the unemployment rate, the SOM rule, the inverted curve, the ISM numbers, just all that stuff. Full-time employment, that was another biggie the other day. But getting back to the article here, he says, economy remains strong, as does the labor market, despite the recent cooling. So you always have to walk this tightrope if you're the Fed, where you can't admit the truth. You've got to just make up these reasons that you're going to be dropping rates. And by the way, he's not just implying that he's going to be dropping rates soon. Notice what he said. that if you keep rates high for too long, or if you don't drop them far enough, what did he say exactly here? He says reducing policy restraint. So in other words, dropping rates too late or too little. That's key. So what he's signaling is not only is he going to be dropping rates, but he's kind of laying cover, if you will, for not just dropping them, but dropping them by a significant amount. So here's where he gets into how he's, justifying just throwing it out there that he could be dropping rates soon, and he could be dropping them by maybe even more than the market expects. At the same time, in light of the progress we've made, both in lowering inflation and cooling the labor market, the progress we've made. Give me a break. I love how they always put themselves at the center of everything. As if it's the Federal Reserve who controls the economy. It's the Federal Reserve who controls the unemployment rate. It's the Federal Reserve who controls interest rates at the long end of the curve. It's the Federal Reserve who controls the amount of dollars in the global monetary system. It's like they have a lever, and they're just sitting there pulling that lever. Oh, that little too much there. Oh, we'll just ease off that. They got another lever over here, another lever over here, and they're just, these incredibly intelligent, clever people that have these amazing, unbelievable insights that we plebs can't even fathom. And they're able just to dial it in to perfection. Oh, we want the unemployment rate to go up to 4.2. Oh, that's no problem. We'll just crank up that dial real quick. As if the free market and the banking system has nothing to do with it. I mean, give me a break. This is such nonsense. But what's incredible is all economic schools of thought believe this garbage. And I'm talking about every single one. Keynesian, Austrian, monetarists, they all think that the Fed is at the center of the monetary universe. And the Fed controls, the entire yield curve, or the Fed controls the unemployment rate. The Fed controls inflation. I mean, it's just, and it's ironic that the Austrians think that, because they're the ones that sit there and say that central planning, rightfully so, and the central planners are completely incompetent. And usually the outcome of the result is the opposite of the intention. But for some reason, when it comes to the Federal Reserve, well, they have all the power in the world. It's really bizarre. But getting back to this here, because we're going to address that here in just a moment when I start really pissing people off. So basically what he's saying is, okay, I've got to start dropping rates soon. We're probably going to drop them lower than the market expects. But we're doing this not because the economy sucks, but because, well, we're just getting closer to our 2% target. And we're very, very confident we're going to get there. So we might as well start dropping rates now. That's the narrative he's trying to push. And so, of course, all of the people at the Fed are going to start singing the same tune here. In recent days, Powell and his colleagues have indicated inflation data has been somewhat encouraging. Of course, you're going to say that because you've got to drop rates, and you need an excuse to do so other than the economy sucks. Inflation is judged by the Fed's preferred, PCE, sure. Powell said, after lack of progress toward our 2% inflation objective in the early part of this year, the most recent monthly readings have shown modest further progress. Okay, I mean, not that much, but I mean, again, this is just, it's so obvious this is just complete spin. More good data would strengthen our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. Okay, so look, at the beginning of the year, what was the CPI? It was maybe 3.4, 3.5. What is it now? Let me look it up real quick. I just want to call out Jerome Powell here, because obviously the people in the mainstream media, for whatever reason, don't. The site can't be reached. What are you talking about here? Okay, so the BLS site is down. Great. Well, that goes back to the competency of the government. They can't even maintain a stupid website, for heaven's sakes. Let's look at it, see if we can find it on the Fed's. Okay, here we go. So, and this isn't even the year-over-year numbers. Jeez. Well, this is all right. So whatever reason, I can't get to the BLS because their website sucks, just like the economy. So bottom line here is, right at the top of my head, at the beginning of this year, we were maybe 3.5. Josh, if you could look that up, I'd greatly appreciate it, where we were as far as the CPI. And I know the Fed doesn't focus on the CPI, but if you could even pull up that, I know there's a chart that we reference all the time that has, probably on the BLS website, that has the PCE and the CPI. But my point here is that it hasn't gone down by much. It's not like it's gone from 3.5 all the way down to, let's say, 2.5. It's maybe gone from 3.5 down to 3.4 or 3.3, something like that. So that just shows you the level of spin we're dealing with here. That's why I wanted to bring it up. Now, here is an example of just these politicians who are completely brain dead, basically repeating what Jerome Powell and the central planners, the central bankers around the world, want the useful idiots that are the politicians to repeat, because the Fed wants you to believe they control the unemployment rate. The Fed wants you to believe they control absolutely everything. So the more people that go out and spew this garbage, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or economists or CNBC or Bloomberg or Twitter or whatever, hey, they're like, fantastic. This is awesome, because they're just helping us pull off this psyop. So this is Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio. I'm concerned if the Fed waits too long to lower rates, the Fed could undo what? The Fed could undo the you see, if any of you think that doing a live stream without any editing is easy, try it sometime. Because you run into these, I don't know if she's just stupid, I'm assuming it's a her, or she can't speak, or this is a typo. We'll just give her or him or whatever, them, don't know their personal pronouns. We'll just sit here and give Miss Moody the benefit of the doubt. So the Fed could undo the progress we've made on creating good paying jobs. Oh, that we've made. I love this. The central planners are the ones that have created the high paying jobs through all their brilliant central planning. It sure as hell isn't those stupid entrepreneurs. No, because they're just greedy. If it was just up to the capitalists and the entrepreneurs, they just create low paying jobs. It's up to the government to make sure that they're creating high paying jobs. I mean, it's so egotistical. It's so condescending, as well as just being so blatantly obviously inaccurate. So anyway, Moody goes on to say, if unemployment trends upward, you must act immediately. And she's telling this to Powell, to protect American jobs. Workers have too much to lose if the Fed overshoots inflation target and causes a completely unnecessary recession. So again, see how the Fed, you got to get it right. Oh my goodness gracious. Holy cow. If you just go up to 5.2 and the correct number is 5, then the whole economy is going to implode because you control everything, Fed. And if you undershoot and go to 1% as opposed to 1.25%, oh my gosh, then inflation, we're going to go straight back to the 1970s. because we know you control everything. And what's amazing, now let's get to the part where I piss everyone off. What's amazing is the Keynesians repeat this. The monetarists repeat this. The Austrians repeat this. But let's go back and look at these top 3 myths and see if there's any validity to this argument. Or at the very least, because I'm not saying that I know all the facts, I know all the truth, but I do know when something doesn't pass the sniff test based on the data, based on the charts. So at the very least, what I'm saying is we have to start questioning this. We have to. This is not the sacred cow that we can't scratch our head and say, well, maybe we should take a different approach. Maybe this isn't true. Maybe what we have been led to believe is inaccurate. We've got to start looking at the things that we have been told over and over and over and over again, and to the point where they don't even need facts to back them up. And we have to start trying to poke holes in this stuff. This is how we progress. This is why they say science, or I would argue economics, advances one funeral at a time. Because once that generation is gone, then finally you can start asking questions. Finally, you can start looking at the data objectively, and then you can have a good, respectful, intelligent debate and start advancing the thought forward and really get to the truth. Okay, so first myth, the Fed controls the money supply. So let's go back to Twitter. Or let's go to Twitter. And I'm just going to reference a tweet here because this was on Zero Hedge the other day. And it was from a gold guy. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus here. So I'm assuming a guy he uses a lot of the words the Austrians use. So let's just read this little bit here. The casual use of the word weapon is apt in the hands of the state monopoly. So you hear this from Austrians all the time. The state monopoly on money. So he says, in the hands of the state monopoly, money can indeed be weaponized. Inflation is the artificial expansion of money and credit that has the effect of transforming wealth from money holders to inflators. This has been done under the guise of policy, appearing official, orderly, legitimate, but involves elites in power taking action that would otherwise be criminal behavior. So what he's referencing here is the Fed, the government. They're printing money, they're printing money, they're printing money. The Fed is or if they're not, they're controlling the banking system. They're creating more of this. And hey, my favorite economist of all time, Milton Friedman, but he wasn't right on everything. One thing he got completely wrong was he looked at bank reserves as what he called high-powered money. So Friedman would sit there and he would argue for the multiplier effect. Well, as the Fed increases the amount of bank reserves, in other words, high-powered money, well, then that increases the balance sheet capacity for the banking system, and therefore they can go ahead and create loans that they otherwise could not have created. So this is the argument here. Well, the Fed is going to expand their balance sheet, and yes, it's true. They're not directly impacting, or they might not directly impact M2 money supply, but the banks will go ahead and extend those loans. And even if the banks don't need the bank reserves, well, then the Fed is going to drop rates artificially low, and then the banks are going to be able to extend more loans than they otherwise would have, and therefore you have more money creation, more fiduciary media. And then even if it's not a result of Fed funds rate, the overnight rate, let's say, well, then it's a result of QE, because QE is bringing down the long end of the curve, and therefore mortgages are cheaper than they otherwise would have been, and you have more credit creation. This is the argument against what I'm saying. So, George, you don't know what you're talking about because everything still goes back to the Fed. It goes back to the Fed's balance sheet, or it goes back to the Fed keeping interest rates artificially low. That's the argument. Well, let's see if it holds up when you look at the data. So now we go over to bank reserves. Let's start with the first, that the Fed controls the money supply, or the government, or whatever. The central planners control the money supply. Okay, so if this is true, then you should see a direct correlation between the bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet and global, not just US, but global dollar money supply. But we'll just focus on the US. So the Fed's balance sheet, and let's look at pre-QE, because it's not like this argument started with QE. So we go to 1980, and I'm just using this time frame because it's just so blatantly obvious that we've got right here at 1980, we've got 42 billion in reserves. You fast forward to 2007, we have what? That would be 42 billion in reserves. The Fed during this time, and you say it went up and down, basically it's on net pretty much identical. Nothing really changed. So the Fed did nothing from 1980 to 2007. And you can take it even further back. I mean, let's go back to look at right here, 1975. We're almost at 40. So from 1975 to 2007, the Fed basically did nothing. Zip, nada. You say, oh, well, they manipulated interest rates. Did they? How did they manipulate interest rates without doing anything in open market operations? Weird. See, because the argument there is if they want to lower interest rates, they're going to buy bonds, create bank reserves, and therefore interbank lending is going to have more cash. And the more cash, the more supply you have, then of course, what happens? Well, you have more supply, and then the interest rate is going to go down, as the theory goes. But you noticed that they raised and lowered interest rates with really not having to do much at all to open market operations. In fact, they did the opposite. When they were raising interest rates, they were increasing the amount of reserves. If the open market operation argument that we're led to believe is true, if that's accurate, then they would have been reducing the amount of bank reserves. Because if you're reducing the amount of bank reserves available, and if banks actually used bank reserves, then what would happen to the interest rate? It would go up. But they're increasing the amount of bank reserves. Everything that you've been told about the Fed is not just incorrect. It's the opposite of the truth. But let's focus on 80 to 2007. So during this time frame, people are going to tell you that the Fed created inflation, that they increased the money supply, that they increased credit, that they increased all these things, but they never look at the Fed's balance sheet to determine if they even did anything. Because when you look at the Fed balance, you see that they did zero. They did zero. Now, we're going to get into interest rates in just a moment. That's the next fallacy. So if you're sitting there pounding the table saying, well, George, they didn't do anything with reserves, but they kept interest rates artificially low, which led to more bank credit being extended. We'll get to that in just a moment. But one thing that my good friend Bob Murphy went over, and I want to address that, is, let's see if we can find it. I think it's the comments. This is the desktop. There we go. So Bob brings up base money, which you can see increases. The problem with bringing up base money and I go over this, in my response to Bob, is that it includes currency in circulation. So currency in circulation has nothing to do with the banking system, because any cash that the banks would have would be included in their reserves. That's in the reserve metric of 40 billion. And by the way, that's vault cash. So how are they settling with vault cash? They're most likely not, which means that my point is even more extreme. So let's just go back to the reserves. What I'm saying here, just to make sure everyone's following, is right here, you had 40 billion in reserves. Right here, you had 40 billion in reserves. But the argument is that this expands the balance sheet capacity for the banking system so they can lend more because they have more reserves for interbank settlement. So they can create that loan, they can transfer that deposit liability to another bank, and then they have the reserves to go ahead and transfer the offsetting asset. So they can go ahead and make that mortgage when they otherwise couldn't, right? Okay, but what we have to do is we have to look at the amount of these reserves that are actually able to be utilized for interbank settlements. Now, I'm sure that vault cash could be used, A, if it's held at the Fed, or B, if they just take it in a massive Brinks truck and just, JP Morgan sends $1 billion or something like that in the Brinks truck over to Wells Fargo. But realistically, especially when we get to 2007, that's not the way it's working. The only thing that they would really use for interbank settlement would be electronic reserves. So if you break down this 40 billion right here in 2007, only 8 or 9 billion was electronic. The other 32, 31 was vault cash. So you had 7.5 trillion in M2 money supply just in the United States, probably 50 plus trillion outside of the United States, with 8 billion in electronic bank reserves that could actually be used for settlement. And you're sitting there telling me that the banking system used bank reserves? Of course they didn't. Of course they didn't. So if the banking system didn't use bank reserves, and it's blatantly obvious through this time period, then why would they be using bank reserves now? Because the argument's going to be, well, it's a lot different now with QE. Why? If they didn't use it back then, why would they use it now? There had to be some element, some component of the transaction that where they got the Fed involved, their balance sheet, it made it cost prohibitive, or it skewed the risk and reward for the transaction. It added an additional cost. So if it added an additional cost that would prompt them to just settle interbank without even the Fed's balance sheet, why is that somehow changed now? Of course not. Of course not. So regardless of what your position on the Fed being at the center of the monetary system, you have to at least acknowledge this and explain how global dollar M2 can go up to 30, 40, 50 trillion, while the number of bank reserves, electronic bank reserves used for settlement, actually went down. The only way that can happen is if the monetary system is functioning completely divorced from the Fed's balance sheet. All right, now let's move on to the next one. Because the argument here is going to be the Fed keeps rates artificially low. Even if they're not manipulating the money supply with the balance sheet, they're doing it with artificially low interest rates. I mean, the first question I would ask there is, well, oh, really? How are they lowering rates if they're not using their balance sheet? Think about this. Rates right here in 1980 were called 18%, overnight Fed funds. We fast forward to 2007, and they're maybe, 5%? So how did rates go from 18% all the way down to 5%, while M2 goes from 1.5 trillion up to 7.5 trillion in the domestic economy, without the Fed doing anything to the amount of bank reserves, if they control the interest rates through the amount of bank reserves? You see, none of it makes sense. None of it makes sense. But everyone thinks this is just the way it works, and that it's written on stones, brought down by Moses from Mount Sinai, just because it's just said over and over and over and over again. How many of you on this live stream right now, if I said, oh, well, the Fed, the Fed has just printed too much money, or the Fed just caused too much inflation, you'd just say, oh, yeah, obviously. Or if I said, oh my gosh, well, during Greenspan and everything, the Fed just kept interest rates artificially low. And that's why we got the housing market bubble. How many of you would say, oh, yeah, of course, obviously. We're all guilty of it. I was guilty of it when I first started this channel. But what happens is you start doing thousands of whiteboard videos and you start trying to explain this to the best of your ability. And you're like, wait a minute. I actually can't explain this because when I look at the facts, it doesn't add up. Let's get on to the next myth: artificially low interest rates. Here's a chart of the spread between the 3-month, which is, well, obviously it's not the 1 month, but it's close to a rate that would be impacted by the Fed increasing or lowering the overnight rate, FFR, Fed funds rate. So what we want to do is we want to compare that to what's happening with the 10-year Treasury yield, which is much more market driven. Because if the Fed had interest rates artificially low, then what that means is you would see a huge spread, because the 10-year Treasury yield, let's just say hypothetically, is at 10%. And if the Fed funds is at 0%, then what the market is telling you is that interest rates are way, 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 way too low at the front end of the curve. If the delta between the two is typically, let's just say 3%. So we can go back, and I'm just going back to this chart. Actually, let me do a max here to make sure we're going. Yeah, this is a max chart. So this goes back to the 1980s, but just, have some fun with it and do some research this weekend and go back to short-term rates and long-term rates in the 1800s when we didn't even have the Fed and see what the delta was back then. If you want to get an average, or what the market force, the free market, would actually produce. But for the sake of this example, let's assume that this average is what we would see in the 1800s, which I'll bet you it's darn close here. But let's say that the delta is usually 2%. Okay, so again, if interest rates were way, 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 way too low, then you would see this spread blowing out. You would see the spread at 5%, 6%, 7%. And you say, well, George, there's times here when it's definitely higher than 2%, if that's the average. I'd agree. Absolutely, of course. But there's also times, and I would argue the majority of time, especially recently, that it's less than 2%. So if it's less than 2%, what that's telling you is that the Fed doesn't have interest rates artificially low. They've got interest rates artificially high. Think about it. Every single time we go into a recession, let's see if I can pull up Fed funds. I think I've got that on Twitter. Here we go. Yeah. So every single time we go into a recession, what does the Fed do? Well, you guys know this. They drop rates. But what has preceded every single recession going back to the 1950s, the 1960s? An inverted yield curve, which means that long-term rates are lower than short-term interest rates, specifically the Fed funds overnight rate. So if the 10-year Treasury is here and the Fed funds rate is here, how is that artificially low? That's artificially high. By definition, just looking at the bond market, the part of the bond market that that the Fed has the least impact on. So the free market, let's say, the free market forces there are telling you that the Fed has interest rates artificially high, not artificially low. So when the Fed drops those rates to a point, let's say the 10-year is trading at 5%, and it drops down to 3%, and then the Fed has dropped rates down to 1%. And everyone says, well, that means that they're artificially low. No. The market is telling you that that's probably where short-term rates would be without the central bank. That's where the market would place them based on the yield of the 2-year and the 10-year, which is what we're using specifically in this example, obviously. So, and then you say, well, my gosh, George, interest rates were 0%. Okay, fine. What was the 10-year Treasury yield? So we go over to this chart, and we've got 10-year Treasury yield. Okay, the 10-year Treasury yield when they had rates at 0 was what? Let's just call it 2%. So let's go to the spread, or back to the spread of the 3-month and the 10-year. What's the average? Close to 2%. And if you go back to the 1800s, likely pretty close to 2%. So now the market might not have put rates at 0, but it would have been darn close. Maybe 25 basis points, 10 basis points. And at the end of the day, is that real? Those 10 basis points, is that really going to move the needle? So I'm not sitting here arguing that the Fed nails interest rates every single time. No. But the evidence would lead you to believe that the highest probability was that the Fed had interest rates artificially high, not artificially low, for the majority of the time, just in this time series going back to, let's call it 1980. That was myth number 2. Myth number 3. QE, well, if the Fed wasn't artificially dropping rates, then how do you explain QE? Because they're buying all of these bonds from 2008. They're doing QE1, QE2, QE3. And obviously, when they're creating all of this additional demand for bonds, then that's going to be dropping the long end of the yield curve, George. So even by looking at the spread, it's completely ridiculous because the spread itself is being manipulated by the Fed. So if the Fed wasn't buying the long end of the curve, the spread probably would have blown out, which would have given you that signal that the interest rates were artificially low. So the fact that the Fed had their finger on the long end of the curve by doing QE, this defeats your entire argument. That would be the pushback. But again, making the same mistake. It's just hearing this over and over and over and over and over and over and over again to the point where you don't even question it. And you just assume that it has to be true. Because so many smart people out there have said the exact same thing that it's not even worth looking up. But what's interesting is if you actually look at a chart of the 10-year Treasury yield and you compare that to QE1, QE2, QE3, and oh, by the way, when they stopped doing QE, you see the opposite. The exact opposite once again. Now, first I'd point out that the trend, even before QE, was down. So you'd have to argue why the trend would have somehow changed once we went through a global recession called the GFC. And so I don't know why that trend would have changed to the upside, but I want to point that out first and foremost. But let's just look at the time frame when they did QE. So what did interest rates do with the 10-year Treasury yield at the long end of the curve when they did QE1? Oh, well, they actually went up, not down. How about QE2? They went up, not down. How about QE3? Up, not down. And notice what happens when they stop doing QE. What happens to rates? That's when they crash. That's when rates crash. So it is true that if you move into QE4, and I believe it's 2020 or so, probably during the cerveza sickness, if you look at QE and interest rates, they did drop. But you've got one time when they dropped and 3 times when they didn't drop and several times when they stopped doing QE and they actually started to go back down. And you know what would be interesting is if we looked at QT, and for some reason they don't have that on this chart because it stops in 2014. But if we looked at QT, I'd be willing to bet that when they did that, rates didn't go up, they went down. And it's pretty much the same thing. Well, let's do this. Let's look at the 10-year Treasury yield. And let's zoom in on the last 5 years. And then let's look at the Fed's balance sheet. Okay, so they started doing QT in, call it June of 2022. And since that time, they have done $1.7 trillion in QT. So, I mean, obviously, by selling this many, I mean, the long end of the curve must have just exploded higher. The 10-year Treasury yield must be, I mean, what, 5% higher than it was in 2022? I mean, that's a lot of QT. And if the Fed is obviously at the center of the monetary universe, and obviously they control interest rates, because when they do QE, obviously rates go down. So when they do QT, I mean, we must have seen a massive spike in the 10-year Treasury yield. So let's look at the 10-year Treasury yield from 2022, end of 2022 to today. See, so we've got 10-year Treasury yield. We go from, let's just be generous here and go back to June. So we're at 3.33. And today, after 1.7 trillion in QT, we are at 4.28. 90 basis points. And oh, by the way, there's been times right here after they've done, let's say, $1.5 trillion in QT, where interest rates on the 10-year were down in the 3.7 range. 3.7 range. So where would we have to go back to find 3.7 that we had in December of 2023? Well, we go back to let's say October of 2022. So October 2022 to December 2023. So let's look at that on the chart. Let's see, wrong chart. Here we go. So let's go to October. No. I'm sorry. Here we go. October, we're at 8.7 trillion. In December, of 2023, we're at 7.7. So they did $1 trillion of QT, and the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury was identical. On top of that, QE 1, 2, 3, they did the opposite rates. And then when they stopped doing QE, rates went down. So you're going to sit there and tell me that the Fed doing QE impacts rates? Maybe, but it does the opposite of what you've been told, if anything. Those are 3 myths. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is to not throw anyone under the bus, but it's simply to get people to think about this stuff that they otherwise never, ever, ever would have thought about, because they just accept these things as though they're fundamental truths because it's been said by so many generations prior to this generation, or it's been said by so many people around us. So my point in bringing this up is to get people to think and to get people to question all of these narratives, even if it's from someone you agree with, even if it's from George Gammon. Absolutely question the narrative. Try to pull up, try to disprove it, because that's how thought and the truth, or that's how thought progresses, and that's how we really, really find truth. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure that you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. We'll see you in the next video.